military organization at IISS, the one who organizes dialogue every year. And he's also the editor of the Asia Pacific Regional Security Assessment. Prior to this, he was a senior fellow at IISS, the Kuan School of Public Policy. And before that as well, he's a fellow or a researcher at CSIS Indonesia. So he is a colleague of our dean, Pak Kuliser Monday. And he got a lot of research on military modernization and also Southeast Asia, regional architecture, and the likes of it. But today, Pak Evan will discuss with us how basically in November, the US will have definitely new president. It's either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. How the new president will to some extent shape or shaping at least Southeast Asia regional architecture, and what kind of a policy direction that these two candidates will shape in relation to Southeast Asia. So without further ado, for the first session we have a 30 to 45 minutes presentation from Dr. Evan Laksmana, and after that we can open up discussion to talk about more on something that probably is not a kind of household yet. It's open-ended, the academic background is there. So please feel free to ask any other question related to US foreign policy direction, perhaps probably Southeast Asia regional architecture. Okay, without further ado, Pak Evan, please.
Thank you, Faisal. Good afternoon, everyone. It's always a pleasure to be here. Sorry, just before I begin, did you say this was Chatham House? Chatham House. Not Chatham, okay. So I should be careful with what I say then. Okay, cool. Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure. And as I'll mention, when Philips asks you to do something, the answer is always yes. You don't say no to Philips. So here I am. But it's always a pleasure to be here. I'm glad that Philips takes the word a brown bag literally. Hopefully it's filled with good stuff. So today I've been asked to talk about US elections and what it means for Southeast Asia. Let me begin by saying, while Philips and I were both trained in the US, none of us are under any pretense that we're actual experts of American politics. It's a nightmare job these days, and it's a tough one. But let me start by saying, once we talk about US elections and Southeast Asia, I'll also be happy to take questions about other topics. See this as partly an Ask Me Anything question. I'll try my best to answer whatever questions you have. If it's not related to the US, if it's related about the region or about something else, I'll be happy to help. And I promise you, I won't take 30 minutes to say what I need to say. 30 minutes is way too long for this kind of back discussion. On the US elections, let me start by saying it doesn't matter who wins. Now, I say that partly joking, but partly also true, because yes, you will see short-term differences in style and articulations and emphasis, but all US presidents will always focus on midterm elections about 6 months after they're elected, so it doesn't really matter in terms of foreign policy agenda. First year of any administration, it will always be domestic in nature. Number two, it doesn't matter because yes, the style and emphasis will be different from the beginning. Trump has his own Project 2025 team and some of the key crazy agenda encapsulated there, but executing a domestic political revenge tour isn't going to take 3 months. It's going to take a while, so that's going to be already. If it's Harris, it's going to be pretty much the same. But what's more important, why it doesn't matter, because for us in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, we have dealt with US security and foreign policy challenges for a long time. So the basic structural features that Southeast Asia and Indonesia has to be ready for is a lot more deeper than who wins the White House. So the first structural feature why it doesn't matter who wins is US-China competition. US-China competition is at a point of no return. It's not going to go back to the heydays of the early 2000s where US and China could work with Southeast Asia and in Southeast Asia together. That millennial dream of the 2000s is dead. It's dead in Beijing, it's dead in Washington. The echo chamber in Washington is more about how much do we give resources to Europe versus Asia, to challenge China? How much should we go in terms of containing China in different aspects of different policy domains? The US-China competition is here to stay. In fact, if you look at the policy trends, Biden actually took some of Trump's policies and make it stronger and harder and with a sharper edge. Export controls, industrial policies, technological export restrictions. So there's a lot of things that is not going to go back to the way it was before. Whoever wins, whether it's Kamala or Trump, a US-China competition will grow. It will be increasingly multi-domain. Southeast Asia's habit of circumnavigating and therefore hiding and therefore avoiding US-China competition will not be sustainable. The habit for Southeast Asia is we don't want to choose, but we also don't want to talk about it. We would rather exploit US-China competition, figure out how we can convince China to invest in the electric vehicle ecosystem in Southeast Asia, try to convince the US to provide market access and others. And so Southeast Asia are actually not shaping US-China competition. They're watching and hoping that they can sidestep the competition, exploit the competition for their own benefit. That, I would argue, it will be increasingly harder to do because, once again, US-China competition is here to stay. The second structural issue that's important and why it doesn't matter is the momentum on US alliances and partnerships. I was in Washington a couple of months ago, and when I speak to senior officials from State Department, DOD, the White House, NSC, and others, the momentum in US alliances right now with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia, with the Philippines is as high as it's been in the last 10, 15 years. There is a genuine push to develop what is known as the lattice work of relationships in which the US is no longer the hub to the spokes of its alliances. So like a wheel, there's a hub and spokes. That model is now gone. What US wants to develop is to make sure the allies themselves become hubs. So Japan's growing security role in the region, Australia's growing security role, South Korea's growing security role, Philippines even. So this relationship around US allies has grown so much so that traditional partners, even like Singapore, who by most measurements would be the deepest security partner in Southeast Asia, is actually seen as not enough. That the benchmark now is because of the US alliance and the momentum, you either follow the path or you step off. The US has no more patience to wait for you to keep saying, I don't want to choose. That's fine, we'll make those choices for you. We'll do what we need to do because things are going well with our allies and momentum is in our side. So that, I think, will be difficult because now Southeast Asia has to be confronted with the question, what is it that we need to do to get US attention? Now, the easiest answer to that for some Southeast Asian policymakers, who cares what the US thinks about us? Do we need US attention? And the answer is, yes, you guys do. Whether we like it or not, in terms of economics, in terms of technology, and in terms of security, the region still does depend on Southeast Asia. On the United States. And so therefore, finding attention in Washington now is also about, can you provide the right diplomatic instrument in DC? Do you engage with the right sectors and groups in DC? And whether or not you are able to convince Washington that, yes, we are willing to work with you. Now, of course, things have gotten much harder to do that since Ukraine and Gaza in particular. When I was in DC, one of the first questions that everybody asked from the officials in Washington is, what is Malaysia doing with Hamas? There's like 50 other questions that's more important, but that's the first thing that they ask. What is Malaysia doing with Hamas? And so if you look at that kind of a line of questioning and you think about the kind of momentum that they have on their side, I think it's increasingly harder to make your case that it's okay for you to work with us. in private, but in public, will keep saying bad things about you. That, I think, is something that the US is increasingly, potentially not going to tolerate anymore. The third and last kind of a structural issue that we need to deal with, regardless of who wins, is the era of US being open and globalized and interdependent and moving forward outside. That era is pretty much done. Right now, we are entering an era of deeper industrial policies, protectionism, export control, and even Biden and Harris's notion of a foreign policy for the middle class is ultimately a domestic-oriented policy. The era of the US economy and political system and resources being drained to maintain global order will be increasingly harder to sustain. And this is why, if it's Kamala, if it's Trump, there will always be a pressure for Europe and NATO, for example, to step up defense spending. There's a reason why Japan has agreed to step up its defense spending for the next 5-10 years, regardless of who becomes US president. Same thing in South Korea, same thing with Australia. And so the trend of working with the United States under the pretense of we can get what we need from the Americans are committed to a globalized version of the world order, I think that part is increasingly harder to sustain. And so with these three structural features in mind, it will be a key challenge for the rest of the region, regardless of who wins. But now, if you look at from the other side, from Southeast Asia's perspective, is the region ready to confront these three challenges, regardless of who wins? And I would argue, no, we're not. We are absolutely far from ready. Policymakers across Southeast Asia tend to cling to this notion that as long as we are non-aligned, that's sufficient. As long as we are non-aligned, we'll keep being able to draw benefits from both sides. I think that's increasingly harder to do. Number two, policymakers' instincts in Southeast Asia to hide and not directly or indirectly shape US-China competition has, I think, will, for the foreseeable future, pose risk, both in terms of geotechnology, in terms of geoeconomics, as well as security and strategy. And so when I was in Malaysia, for example, last month, a high-ranking senior Malaysian official says, yes, things are so bad, look at what's happening to the Philippines, and so we are committed to put all of our eggs into the basket of assuring China that we're fine. So rather than investing in contingency planning, security thinking, new partnerships, diversity, some countries like Malaysia is prepared to say, let's make China happy towards us. That's also the kind of interesting thing that even Vietnam has no choice but to contemplate. Vietnam is probably the country in Southeast Asia that has the most acute threat environment vis-a-vis China. And it's the only country in Southeast Asia that's actually fought a war against both the United States and China within one generation. And so I think the region's thing to not talk about contingency planning, not to seriously address not their own strategic readiness, but also across the region is a challenge. And across Southeast Asia, what I've noticed in the last 6 months of travels across the region, everybody wants to do it their own way. So the Frank Sinatra doctrine of security policy is growing. I want to do it my own way. Yeah, I don't care what Vietnam is doing. I don't care what Philippines is doing. My way is better, so I'm going to do it my way. And so the gap in security relationships between different Southeast Asian establishments, particularly between mainland and maritime Southeast Asia, and even between maritime Southeast Asian states themselves, I think is growing. This brings the question, I think, for Southeast Asia about the role of ASEAN. ASEAN, in theory, should be that main strategic platform, the main option for Southeast Asian states to respond to US-China competition, to regional security challenges like the South China Sea and others. What I would argue is that ASEAN is not it. ASEAN is it for other things, but is not it to deal with US-China competition. It's not it when it comes to a regional security flashpoint. So accepting ASEAN's potential and limitation is the first start of thinking through what are your options. And I think this is why in the last 10 years, whether you like it or not, Indonesia has been missing. Indonesia's leadership in ASEAN has been shallow, inconsistent, and it's not very deep. And so it's not a surprise that other countries are contemplating non-ASEAN options. Whether it's joining BRICS, whether it's OECD, whether it's other unilateral settings or even bilateral partnership, the ranking of ASEAN as the #1 policy response to strategic challenges, I think, has gone down in most Southeast Asian states. Ironically, it's only in Indonesia in which we are unable to come up with a non-ASEAN response. ASEAN has become a golden cage, in fact, for Indonesian foreign policy. What's the problem? ASEAN. South China Sea? ASEAN. US China? ASEAN. Somehow, Indonesia is unable to come up with non-ASEAN option for strategic and security challenges. Now, keeping in mind that Indonesia's policy ecosystem itself, I think in the last 10 years, has been severely fractured between sort of the more international economic wing of it, the more defense side of things, and the more traditional multilateral instincts, including ASEAN. And so the incoherence within each country's strategic policy-making system across Southeast Asia is also one of the reasons why I'm less optimistic, I guess, for the ability of Southeast Asia to confront the structural challenges on U.S. foreign policy. And let me end by suggesting that, you know, as the issues around U.S. foreign policy moving forward will be centered on the competition with China, issues that are increasingly multi-domain. It's no longer just a defense and military stuff, it's also critical minerals, it's also AI, it's also trade, it's also investment, education, and others. Southeast Asian strategic policymakers should stop siloing and compartmentalizing relationships with great powers. Let me do economic stuff with China, let me do security stuff with the United States. That era, I think, is an understandable reaction and legacy from the past, but I would argue that will be increasingly hard to sustain. The second, I think, challenge for Southeast Asia, because we are not prepared for geopolitical crisis, what happens if there's a contingency in Taiwan? Now, of Southeast Asian policymakers, you ask that question, their first answer would be, we have one China policy. We don't support Taiwan in that sense of being independent from China, etc. Absolutely fine. The question is, what do you do with close to 1 million Southeast Asian citizens in Taiwan? Do we have access to Taiwanese bunkers? We have a humanitarian corridor to transport them via ships. What ships are available if the China put a blockade? Is there a cooperative mechanism between Philippines and Vietnam and Malaysia and Indonesia to transport their citizens to Philippines? Because it's not like Ukraine, there is no land route, so you have to transport them somewhere. If there is a Chinese blockade or quarantine, presumably leaving would be air or water. But those requires pre-arranged SOPs. Do we have that? If there is a crisis in Taiwan, who does Southeast Asia talk to in Taiwan? There is no ASEAN-Taiwan forum. Our trade representatives in Taipei are actually that, trade people, and visa and consular people. There is no defense attachés in Taiwan from Southeast Asia. And so, with potential crisis brewing, whether it's in Taiwan or in the South China Sea, Southeast Asia need to start doing more stuff with each other a lot better and start investing in their collective capabilities and relationships, not just surrendering to the fate of, yes, US-China competition is here, there's nothing we can do about it, we're going to watch it, or at least we'll have relationships with the US or China. And that we sort of forget that the region is close to each other. And so this, I think, is a much more fundamental challenge for Southeast Asia than whether or not it's Trump versus Harris. Let me end there, and I'll open up to Q&A.
Thank you so much. Give you a round of applause. It's a very succinct, but a lot of important insight, I think, on U.S.-China rivalry and how it affects Southeast Asia, and particularly Indonesia, perhaps. So I think I have a lot of questions to ask, but for that, let me open up a question session for all of you. Anyone who have a question? I think we can do it one-on-one, right? So there's a question, and then Evan will answer directly. Okay, please state your name and your affiliation, right?
Sorry.
Hello.
Yeah. Sorry, can I ask some bottled water? Thank you. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Yusha. I'm a PhD student in political science. That's very interesting arguments that you have brought. My question is, not only Indonesia, in this year we also have new president, Prabowo Subianto. Given your argument about the urgency to choose sides, what do you think Prabowo will act given the urgency of this geopolitical issue and Indonesian foreign policy of the active? And two, in your opinion, how can he, as a president, safely navigate this issue? That's all. Thank you.
Obviously, there's a lot of layer to Prabowo's planning and policy parameters and all of that. Most of which I can speak publicly since it's being recorded. So we can talk more about that later on. But there's number one, a lot of misconception of what is bebas aktif. Bebas aktif is not neutrality. Bebas aktif is also not non-alignment. I think it's a misconception. For example, but I remember participating in a debate during the campaign with some folks where it's a question mark whether Israel-Palestine is in Indonesia's strategic interest as opposed to a domestic political interest. And so a hard-nosed understanding of Indonesia's strategic interest, I think, has to come much sooner. And I think when it comes to the socialization of independent and active, alignment, all of that, I think it's safe to say that that fits within Prabowo's foreign policy instincts. I think his travel schedule over the last few months should tell you that. I think it will be hard to get Prabowo to fundamentally and publicly distance Indonesia from one country without good reason and all of that. But I worry whether or not the policy infrastructure supports that, right? Because it's one thing for you to be a foreign supports that, right? Because it's one thing for you to be a foreign engage and have good relationship with everyone. It's another to follow up on it. A foreign policy infrastructure, strategy, policy planning process that's not just about travel schedule. And I think this is the challenge. With Prabowo's energy, with Prabowo's foreign policy instincts, will Indonesia develop the foreign policy strategy and infrastructure to make it work and not just to sort of rely on his personal touch, his personal relationships, and his personal visits. So I think that is the first big question mark moving forward. The second issue when it comes to great powers is that it's not just US and China now. With Ukraine, you have additional fault lines like Russia. Vietnam is a good example where probably Vietnam is the only country in which it's not a country of strategic power relationship is wider than just US and China. The relationship that's required to maintain stability on that front, I think, is increasingly harder. The third, I think, challenge would be ASEAN, because I worry if there is a conflation between ASEAN as a grouping and its multilateral mechanisms, its East Asia Summit, ASEAN Regional Forum, etc., and there are about 1,200 meetings a year versus individual Southeast Asian states. Doing stuff with Vietnam is not doing stuff with ASEAN. Doing stuff with Malaysia is not doing stuff with ASEAN. And vice versa. Successfully having and organizing East Asia Summit is not the same as improving a relationship on Myanmar, on Thailand, on Vietnam, and others. So separating individual Southeast Asian states' relationship plus ASEAN, I think, will be a challenge. Because let's face it, given the list of agenda that the upcoming administration seems to be seriously contemplating, will President Prabowo and ultimately his team have sufficient strategic bandwidth to deal with the multiple foreign policy challenges? And this is where I think issues around the foreign ministry has to be part of the conversation. Is the foreign ministry at a time now an organizational lethargy, or are they able to jump on the wagon and sort of follow the energy of the upcoming president. Because whether we like it or not, for good or for bad, we are going to see an active international president, much more than Jokowi.
Okay, any follow-up question? Okay, moving forward. Yeah, please state your name. Or perhaps there is a woman who will ask first. Okay, let's go on.
Thank you very much, Pak Evan. My name is Sonia. I am a PhD student from the Faculty of Social Science. My question, would it be better, if I am not mistaken, EU has a foreign policy for its member state. Would it be better if ASEAN also has the same thing, so we can deal better with the crisis?
Do you mean for ASEAN member states to have
A shared foreign policy? Common foreign policy.
So kind of like what the EU has basically for a common foreign and defense policy? I'd say no. ASEAN isn't designed for that. ASEAN is designed as a safe space for everyone to be who they are, whether you're a monarchy like Brunei or a communist state like Vietnam or a quasi-democracy like Indonesia. We're all the same. But it's impossible to imagine a communist Vietnam and a monarchical Brunei and Indonesia and Malaysia all have the same foreign policy. And in fact, pushing it will highlight how different we are. For what ends? Because there is no common resources. With EU, there is a common resources, there's a common direction. You empower Ursula von der Leyen. Who are we empowering? ASEAN Secretary General is more secretary than general. So ASEAN is not designed for a common institutional actor behaving independently with resources on behalf of the member states and all of these things. We're not designed for it. In fact, I would argue it is a fundamental mistake that people assign EU benchmarks for ASEAN benchmarks. I think it's a very dangerous trajectory. It's not in line with our own strategic history, and it's committing a lot of resources and headache and capital for a result that's going to be bare minimum. Why? Because everything that we have since the ASEAN Charter is presumably a collective decision anyway. And so what we've had in the last 10, 15 years are pretty much lowest common denominator documents. And that's okay, because that's the only way it's going to work. Unless you accept that everybody's going to behave the same democratic system, same values, will never happen. And in fact, forcing it to happen is why ASEAN fights a lot. So if the original purpose of ASEAN is to keep everybody happy in their safe space, I say why bother?
Okay, thank you, Eva. So it's a kind of a ASEAN skeptical. You can try to make kind of compartmentalize between whether are you a ASEAN but of course having a common and security policy is way too high in terms of bar that we need to pass on. Next one, probably, yeah, please state your aim and also affiliation.
Assalamualaikum. My name is Ashik Alahi. I am doing my MA in Political Science at this university. So my question is based on some of your arguments that in ASEAN countries, US policy is like US pressure is mounting on the ASEAN countries that you must choose a side. As we are currently seeing that ASEAN countries are making a balance between US and China. According to this pressure, in case ASEAN countries choose to be with US, how the ASEAN geopolitics will look like, and if the ASEAN chooses to be with China, how does it look like? Thank you.
I think if you look at history, particularly during the Cold War, of course, the example of a region divided between communist and free world is a strong term, but for a second, let's assume it's the West versus East or democracy versus communism in Southeast Asia. Those are bad labels, but for argument's sake, let's assume that's the case. The division across Southeast Asia was not good. right? The kinds of intra-regional conflicts and war was part of the reason why we had ASEAN. Sure, at the beginning it was a challenge because we didn't really incorporate all of the members. So Vietnam and Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos only happened pretty much in the 90s. But if we are to revert back to that era of a bifurcation across the region in Southeast Asia between a set of countries that falls under, a Pax Americana and the other side, Pax Sinica, I think we are going to see a repeat of some of those division and tension. The issue, I think, is whether or not we can get away with it again as we did for much of the Cold War. Given the weakening state of ASEAN, so I should be clear, I'm not an ASEAN skeptic. I'm a loving critic of ASEAN. I criticize because I love ASEAN. I want it to be better. And not take ASEAN for granted by saying, as long as we have ASEAN, things are enough. Because that argument presumes ASEAN is this magical entity that's doing stuff and talking to people. It's not. ASEAN is a leaders-led group. So don't get the leaders off the hook. They have to lead ASEAN. They have to do stuff. And so the only way to prevent that future bifurcation is that, are you going to make choices ignoring ASEAN as an option and therefore focus on your specific set of interests with US and China in whichever way you want to go? Or are you saying that there is a middle ground that we all collectively can work on and we all can collectively lead on to provide that buffer so that we don't become a Pax Sinica versus Pax Americana situation? So for me, instinctively, I think of ASEAN as that potential answer. But in the absence of genuine leadership, leadership is not chairmanship. We now depend on the ASEAN chairs as if you're not chair, you can't do anything. That Indonesia takes a backseat to Laos and Brunei and Cambodia, for me is kind of like, if Indonesia claims to be a leader, does it matter who's the chair of ASEAN? The problem is we reached the point where ASEAN is now overly bureaucratized that it does matter who the chairmanship is. And so for me, that sense of leadership unfortunately does fall under Indonesia's shoulder. And I'm not sure yet that there is a realization among our political leaders that because it falls on us, we have to take it seriously, invest seriously, commit seriously to it, and fix it rather than complaining about how slow it is. We've all been in ASEAN meetings. I've been. It's super boring. I get it. But it has certain values because of the way it's been designed, coming out of that strong bifurcation during the Cold War. So yeah, I do worry of that future bifurcation. But I'm also not convinced that we have sufficiently committed ourselves into coming up with an alternative. A Pax ASEANA sounds good on paper, hasn't really existed yet.
Great. Yeah. Let's move on to Parish. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Can I just, before I ask my question, in a way my question was asked just now, but you talk about this rivalry between democracy and communism. I think it's important to remember that for all intents and purposes, China today, in terms of its diplomacy and its activities internationally, is a capitalist state. Yeah, so it's two rival capitalisms that we're talking about here. And this is not the Cold War. Yeah, China's not exporting Mao today. It's exporting cement and bridges and ports. But let's put ourselves in a situation, say 5 years or even 2 years from now, and we've already taken sides. We've already taken sides. Half of ASEAN has said, okay, that's it. We want your investment, we go with China. The other half says we can't afford to lose the security umbrella, we go with America. So ASEAN is divided. Now in a situation like that, my question is, taking into account, and I appreciate your point about ASEAN not being the EU. ASEAN was never meant to be something like the EU. Would it still be possible for the states within ASEAN to maintain some semblance of normative conduct the way we have, even though we are now divided into two hegemonic blocs? So half of us are in Washington's pocket, the other half of us are in Beijing's pocket, but we still need to trade and we still need to move. We've made enormous advances in terms of simple things like mobility of Southeast Asians within Southeast Asia. I don't see that coming to an end. Yeah, just because our region is carved up. It's not as if we are not going to further enhance mobility of Southeast Asians, educational opportunities for Southeast Asians. So let's just future think here for a while. What do you think is going to look like?
So we are, I think, in the middle of a trend right now. The trend isn't over. The trend can still go back or not. But I'm of the view that it's a point of no return in terms of U.S.-China competition. Managing competition for as long as possible seems harder now to justify domestically in DC and certainly in Beijing. So the trajectory of Asian competition, I think, we're in the middle of it. The catalyst about whether or not, if you do stuff with China, you're not getting access to my market. If you do training exercise with the US, you're not getting past our borders. And so we haven't reached that point, but we've seen bits and pieces of it. We've seen this in critical mineral stuff. The way that Washington is concerned that some of China's green products, whether it's solar panels and others, are being washed through Southeast Asia for further export to America is coming to an end. I think Washington is catching on, right? Like, well, actually, you say this is from Malaysia or Thailand, Indonesia, it's actually Chinese goods, so maybe we shouldn't let you in. So that era, I think, we start to see pieces of it. So we haven't seen the catalyst, which I would venture would come in a breaking point over a conflict. Before Ukraine and Gaza, a lot of people would argue that breaking point is going to be over Taiwan, because I think South China Sea is lost to the Chinese anyway. But Taiwan, I think if Taiwan is lost, then Japan is lost, then all American security presence in Asia is done. And so Taiwan is a higher stake problem. Now, the challenge is whether or not China also gets blamed now for Ukraine. Will China get blamed as well for its support for Iran and others? So this sort of branching out of the challenge on China or putting China as the disrupting force, I think might slow down that timeline and therefore make Taiwan perhaps a few years down the line. But in a system that is the CCP now under Xi Jinping, if Xi Jinping wakes up one day, has a bad headache and decides to go to Taiwan, we can't really stop him. But my sense is that we won't reach the point where the region really cannot do stuff together with US and China, and it is the point where it will be split. You really probably can get away with doing stuff with both. But if there is a conflict, there is a breaking point in Taiwan, then I think it will be almost impossible to control for two things. Number one, the dynamics of escalation in Taiwan with US and China. No wargaming, no defense analysts, no military planners I've heard or spoke to says we absolutely cannot rule out nuclear escalation. Nobody can say that because the closeness of Taiwan to mainland, some of the way that the war planning is being developed, nuclear escalation is not something that they can rule out. The second point is, again, in terms of economic impacts and investments and stuff, the cost will be so high that it's impossible for us to do business as usual for Southeast Asia and certainly beyond Southeast Asia. So when that time comes, I hope Southeast Asia has some contingency thinking and planning as opposed to praying that we don't see war, because as we all know, praying isn't really strategy.
Yeah, please.
Sorry, I take your point, but my question was, in the event that we have a split, half of ASEAN, US, half of ASEAN, China, my question is, do you think that intra-ASEAN, legal developments, all these old norms that we've established, can that still continue? Do you think that we will still see
ASEAN working together to improve things like migration, education, healthcare.
Right, sorry, I missed that point. The problem with intra-ASEAN is that we made a mistake, in my view, in the 90s and early 2000s when we decided to export the ASEAN way by creating the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia Summit, ADMM+. I think it was too fast and too furious. We literally just got Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam, what, 5, 6, 7 years at that point in time? And so there is no intra-ASEAN integration yet at that point. But then in 2003 and onwards, we now pretend like we can now do this while our energy is actually split with East Asia Summit and others. So that, I think, is the first issue. Second, economically, intra-ASEAN economic engagement actually declined. There's too many economic incompatibilities between ASEAN member states. In fact, the ability for us to have RCEP, CPTPP, IPREF, and others within one region isn't about intra-ASEAN anyway. It's about ASEAN with others. And the ASEAN-China FTA, why it keeps being renegotiated until 3.0 version now is precisely because of that, right? And so I wonder if we assume the world is split and ASEAN is also split. If you add that fault line into intra-ASEAN relationship, I think it's going to get worse because ultimately the persistence of historical bilateral irritants also has to go away. I went to the Philippines 2 months ago, and their defense people still says, "But Sabah is ours." Well, you know, are you sure you want to go down that route, right? And so it's the same thing with Cambodia and Vietnam and Laos. It's the same thing with Indonesia and Malaysia, with Philippines and Malaysia, Vietnam and the rest of mainland Southeast. So with the presence of bilateral irritants not gone, intra-ASEAN integration actually happens very unequal and bits and pieces. Economic incompatibilities are high. Social movement is not multi-directional. Like most people in Southeast Asia would want to move to Singapore, but do you see a long line of people moving to Myanmar? Right? So intra-ASEAN is unequal at best from a mobility standpoint. Security standpoint, I think is probably there's some resemblance of good news, just because I think intra-ASEAN security engagement has been pretty strong. It's a bit more practical, and we've been doing this over and over, particularly between the mainland Southeast Asian states. But even then, I'm not convinced because ultimately, intra-ASEAN relationship has centered on improving bilateral irritants and bilateral issues like between Singapore and Malaysia, between Singapore and Indonesia. The focus has been on bilateral. What happens if the question isn't bilateral? What happens if the question is regional order? And if there is a conflict, I'm not convinced Singapore's position will be, or Philippines for that matter. So it's untested, we don't know, it's speculative, but my sense is it'll be harder for intra-ASEAN to be improved in that.
Thank you, Evan. Next, probably before going to faculty members, we can ask students to ask. So one, and then anyone else? Okay, let's go with Kuan first, yeah. Then
This one, and I joined from Vietnam. I'm also an MA student in law school, political science. I would like to ask you that I know that we talk a lot about, and you have just talked a lot about your features in the ASEAN collectively in dealing with the situation that we are having now in the regional order. But I would like to ask that if there is a change in the foreign policy approach of Vietnam, more active member in promoting a more consolidated ASEAN way. Would it be enough to create a new political momentum that is significant enough for the ASEAN to collectively deal with the current situation, with the current regional situation? For example, like Vietnam can become a more active member and collaborating with countries, with leading ASEAN countries like Indonesia in consolidating the group. And would that be enough for us to maintain our political autonomy without dividing the group? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Let me start with the end of your comment, which is autonomy. Everybody says strategic autonomy, right? Europe, Southeast Asia. Everybody says it. What do they do about it? Asserting autonomy is not the same as sustaining autonomy. And so it's easy to say, I'm doing stuff with Russia as well as with China because autonomy. Now, yes, in some sense that's true. It is up to you, not you, but like us to make a choice. Yes, of course, making choices can be one sign of autonomy. But when you unpack that concept of autonomy and you look at the environment, I think it gets a lot more complicated. So let me take that point on Vietnam. I think certainly Vietnam and Indonesia are perhaps the two, for lack of better terms, contending hegemon of Southeast Asia. They both feel they have leadership aspirations across the regions in different ways, in different domains, but different historical trajectories. So in mainland Southeast Asia, sure, I can see Vietnam being that leader, and I think certainly within the context of nobody in Southeast Asia is going to worry that Vietnam will follow Pax Seneca, right? I think that's pretty safe. The issue, I think, is, well, hopefully with the transition happening in Hanoi, hopefully things will stabilize. I'm not convinced. When I was in Hanoi, just as the secretary was traveling, I feel like people are still not settled. I think they're still waiting to see what he will do in the next few years, at least until the next Congress. So there's a bit of wait and see. But that aside, I think Vietnam's instincts are the right trajectory in terms of, yes, we want to see autonomy, but therefore that means as a matter of policy, we have to build our own AI ecosystem. We have to develop our own domestic defense industry. So that sense of doing stuff on our own, I can understand as well, right? But when it comes to foreign policy in ASEAN, here's why it gets tricky. Number one, that historical bilateral irritant I mentioned hasn't gone away. The concern by some maritime Southeast Asian states that Vietnam is ultimately still communist hasn't gone away. Vietnam's strength is actually its relationship with China with party ties. That's the kind of relationship that nobody else has across ASEAN. But in fact, that can be seen as a weakness because some countries are worried that Vietnam will not follow their specific values. The second point of concern has to do, I think, with the four no's policy of Vietnam. No alliances, no military base, and so forth and so on. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with foreign no's as a matter of principle, but the problem with that approach is, I don't know how long you've been in Indonesia, but there is a dance in Indonesia called Poco Poco, which is basically you take one step forward, two steps backward. So Vietnam's approach is kind of like that. You do stuff with the United States, so let's say to reduce Vietnam's dependence on Russian military equipment, and you do more stuff with China by offering railways. So this instinct of balancing one great power with the other makes sense, but if taken to the extreme, it's very inconsistent, and it's hard to get around where Vietnam stands. Now, of course, I understand from Vietnam's thinking, that's the only way they survive, this is how we assert autonomy, but where does ASEAN rank in that becomes an issue, because ASEAN actually could hinder or potentially contradict Vietnam's foreign nose instincts. And this is where I think it's challenging. When I had a 2-hour conversation with a Vietnamese official, I won't say from which agency, at the end of it, they inadvertently accepted that for defense and security stuff, ASEAN is not the main platform. And so Vietnam, I think, is quite pragmatic in understanding the landscape, makes sense. You have the closest memory to an actual war in the past generation. So from that standpoint, that makes sense. But have we reached the point where Vietnam is fully socialized in all of ASEAN's values and instincts and mechanisms so that when Vietnam does take the lead, which I think it should, and I think the goal here for all of us in Southeast Asia is to eventually see where every country can take the lead in their own way across ASEAN. But Vietnam, I think, is at an interesting juncture, and this balance between economic ties with China and Japan and United States and Australia. I think the way I understand the conversation in Hanoi, it's so complex and fragile. It still works, but until there's more clarity in how Vietnam orders its ranks, its foreign policy platform, has overcome the historical acrimonious past with mainland Southeast Asia, with the rest of maritime Southeast Asia, which I think hasn't happened because Vietnam is one of perhaps the only country of ASEAN that hasn't really had a major military exercise with another ASEAN country. Everybody else has. So for me, this goes back to what I said earlier, the intra-ASEAN integration, in which Vietnam was a key goal in the 90s to finally bring Vietnam from the cold into ASEAN, hasn't really been completed. And so this will take more time. But yes, to take the long answer short, absolutely, I think Vietnam should take the lead for ASEAN. But how and how fast and to what extent, I think remains a question. And it's not unique to Vietnam. I also question Indonesia's leadership.
Any follow-up question? Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thank you for your insightful presentation. So my name is Izul. I'm from political science student. I want to ask you regarding situation on the US election. We don't know who will win. I'm sorry if my question or other deviate from our topic today, but what would be your prediction regarding future US trajectory support of Middle East escalation? As we know, things are getting worse. Escalation expanded between Israel, not only with Gaza, but also with Hezbollah and Iran as well. You know that Iron Dome has been breached just last night. Do you think that, I don't know who will win, but we don't hope that actually, will it worsen the situation in Middle East? Because the situation right now, Biden administration is very careful at doing standpoint towards Middle East situation. Thank you.
I think nobody knows the answer to that question. Because I think the issue with Israel, Palestine, Israel and Iran and Hezbollah right now, let's assume for a second that's the problem and not just what's happening in Gaza. The problem is, how much influence does America actually have over Bibi? I think the answer to that question isn't as straightforward as one might think. If I would say half of Washington believes that Washington actually has the leverage to pressure Israel into doing X, Y, and Z, they still can't do it without pressuring Bibi. The filter is Bibi, right? Unless there's some miracle and Bibi calls for an early election, whatever, the new mandate, whatever, I think it'll be hard. But right now, what's happening works in Bibi's favor. Its position is stronger. No Israel body politic is going to walk away from a wartime leader right now as things are escalating. So if you ask me, things are working in Bibi's favor. And I say Bibi separately from Israel because I'm not sure Israel's security interest is actually protected by certain types of escalation. But that being said, on the American side, yeah, I think you're right that everyone, Democrats or Republicans, are using the Israel-Palestinian conflict or the Middle East conflict in general as a way to undermine each other's position. So it is a political football in that sense. Which ones are genuine geopolitical concerns versus domestic political concerns are not entirely clear to me. The thing with Trump is he prides himself in deal making. He tried to do that with the North Koreans, and are we convinced that Trump won't try to attempt some sort of major peace deal? He might, but I doubt the relationship and the net is there after October 7th. It's just things are very different, and I think American society is much more polarized because of the conflict than ever before. So it's not as straightforward. So I think a referendum on U.S. foreign policy to the Middle East is a part of the election. So you will see what happens only after November. For the time being, I think the approach right now for ceasefire and all of that, it perhaps a little bit more urgent than the long-term ceasefire between Israel and Hamas and the PA and all of that. Because I think Iran changes the strategic equation significantly in ways that I don't think even the U.S. can easily control. Just like parts of the U.S. can easily control what Zelensky did in Ukraine in terms of its own invasion across Russian borders, right? So I think we are in for a rough ride. I don't know if the U.S. has easy leverages to play against Bibi. I think Bibi feels he's winning domestically, but I listen to my colleagues who know Middle East more than me. My impression of listening to my colleagues who know the Middle East more than me, this is a generational marker. The conflict itself in Gaza, but also more broadly, it's a generational marker. So even if things are solved tomorrow, the ramifications will last longer than ever before. So this is almost as profound as 1967. So whatever the consequences are, whoever wins, I think we still have to be ready for it. And as Southeast Asia, pretty sure we're not.
Okay, great. Probably Pak Edi, you have a question? Please.
Thank you. My name is Edi Hala. I am a post fellow, and I'm also a lecturer at the International Relations Department, University of Jember. Thank you for the presentation. I have two questions. I think this is a kind of worst scenario in Southeast Asia. I would like to know, in the past, we know the conflict between the US and Soviet Union was about ideological conflict, and there was a war between US and Soviet allies. To what extent the current conflict, which one is more difficult? We have Cold War in the past, and now I'm not really sure what is the reason behind the conflict. I think you said that there is no way back. So that's the first question. The second one, there is still optimistic view regarding the policy of Southeast Asian countries. There's a concept like a 18 policy, for example. And there's still space for ASEAN countries to maneuver with activities to compete to these two big power. So, what do you think of this concept? How long the ASEAN country can do the fixed policy?
Thank you, Pak, for that question. Let me start with the Cold War part first. I think Cold War is a lot more dangerous. I think the way the world was on constant brink of nuclear war was a lot more serious. I think people from that generation learning to duck and cover is a lot more pervasive than today. So the threat of nuclear war, the tripwires all over the world, whether it's in, I think was certainly a lot more dangerous. Just because there was no hot war between US and Soviet, however, that does not mean that the rest of the world wasn't hot in terms of conflict, right? So they sort of fought these peripheral battles for their interests. So the rest of the world does not see the dangers around the U.S. nuclear side of the equation. So, is it more dangerous today or Cold War? I think Cold War is probably a lot more dangerous. We are not at that stage yet. I'm not even convinced that Cold War is the right analogy for what we are seeing now. But yeah, it is a competition, a useful heuristic device or conceptual tool to use, fine. And this goes to the second point on hedging. So this is where I take off my academic hat. You know, as somebody who's gone to grad school and everything, we are taught to love theory, right? Concepts and all of that. And when I went to the US, concepts and theory is sort of drilled into your head. So when I take off my academic hat, I would say a few concepts that we take for granted, like middle powers, hedging, is actually pretty horrible as a concept. It's a bad concept. And hedging is one of those things that sound good for academics to make sense of state behavior, but there is no hedging policy. There's no document that says this is Indonesia's hedging policy. Hedging is not policy. Hedging is an instinct. We have an instinct to not do X, Y, and Z, but then academics call that hedging. But policymakers themselves, do they wake up every day, how am I going to hedge today? They don't. So for me, as a policy label, soft power, middle powers, hedging, it's fine. We'll use it all the time, no matter how horrible the concepts are, and undefined and not really driving the thinking. But the worry for me is that hedging becomes an excuse to not do anything. Inaction is hedging. Not choosing is hedging. Doing stuff with both is also hedging. So if it's everything, then what is hedging? So for me, as a tool of analysis, I can understand the utility of hedging, but as a policy construct, as a policy driver, I would say hedging is a lot closer to an instinct that comes from history, policymakers' experience, etc. The kind of socialization of certain terms, like data update, for example. Sure, you can feel that instinct in the minds of policymakers, but it is definitely not policy. If it is a strategy, it's a bad one, because there is no outcome other than no conflict, right? So for me, I would be careful in terms of thinking of academic constructs as transported into policy debates as if they're one and the same, and I just don't think it's the same. Just like, for example, everyone still talks about middle power as a debate, as a policy construct, but if you put back the academic hat, middle to what? Power to do what? That's an unresolvable question. Both middle and power are the most nebulous concepts in political science. So it's a dead end intellectually, but it's useful for policymakers from small countries to say, we're a middle power. We're not the US and China, but we're not Laos and Cambodia, maybe. But it's useless as a concept. So for me, I guess this speaks to the broader point about Cold War framing. I think there are conceptual lessons from that era that I think may sound like it's useful, whether it's containment, whether it's Cold War, whether it's bipolarity, balance of power, etc. But there are limits to those concepts once you put them into an actual conversation with various policymakers.
Okay, thank you. So we have 10 minutes left. So is there any questions so far? Okay, one more question here. Please. Or two more questions. Okay, make it brief.
My name is Akbar from Public Policy program at this university, climate change program. Frankly speaking, this morning, I'm closely watching the vice presidential debate, the CSIS to Argentina, both the vice president between the Lone Wolves and also the G defense put the foreign policy affairs on the table. Mexico will export in regards to the regional model of ever like debating each other in regards how Democrat and the Republic ahead of the US election in November. So to the best of your opinion, do you have any argument about to what extent US domestic policy will leverage or influence their commitment to the climate? Because in 2015, they are not ratified this Paris Agreement. In 2020, they are not ratified, in my opinion. Correct me if I'm not. In 2020, they are not ratified, but the Joe Biden administration provides several instruments to become a party again in 2020. Now, to the best of your opinion, how can the US political domestic influence, especially when it comes to the region of Southeast Asian nations? Thank you.
So, want to take a second?
Can I just touch on the language and stuff about not to be strategy, whatever, but of course, surely not choosing is to choose, not doing is to do. And I think what you're trying to say is that the US will not tolerate anymore, or US policymakers will not tolerate people not choosing to choose, or not doing to do. But forgive me, but in this presentation so far, we talked a lot about US foreign policy. Can I just tease you a bit about how do you think the Chinese are looking at this? I mean, are the Chinese also saying what the hell's wrong with these civilizations? And will the Chinese also, you think, in time, be as demanding and belligerent as if you have to choose now, because we're not going to wait anymore? Because this changes things. When both sides will not tolerate what we call hedging, then the stakes are rise in Southeast Asia. A bit about China, perhaps?
Yeah, and I think this relates to the question on climate change as well. So let me touch on the climate change stuff. I think certainly what is the most difficult for people, who not just look at U.S. foreign policy, but we've lived in the U.S. before. I came to the U.S. at the height of Obama. I left at the height of Trump. Two different countries, right? And so, what's difficult now with U.S. foreign policy discourse and rhetoric, particularly if you're so focused on the election, is you can't really tell which one is a foreign policy argument, which one is a domestic partisan one. It's a very difficult one. I'm unpacking whether, yes, I'm saying these things because I believe China is bad, versus I'm doing these things because I care about my constituents doing X. Very difficult to unpack. Let's assume you don't know how to unpack. Let's assume they're all one and the same. I think the challenges around climate change for America, as we can see with John Kerry's frustration at times, is that it is now a China policy shop. In the past, the hope was that the climate change shop will be separate and that things can work together because you don't have a climate change thing without China, right? And so I think when they started, they thought they can isolate this climate change sector from the rest of the China policy shop. I think that's increasingly harder to do now. And so once you accept that there is no longer division between climate and China policy shop, that they're one and the same, then this is where you start to see the policies around the Inflationary Reductionary Act, tariffs over EVs and others. So they now see climate change as a tool to pressure China as well. You can justify it by saying climate change, ESG standard, and so forth, but it's not. So I'll give you an example with Indonesia. Indonesia has a very difficult task convincing the Americans, whether in the White House or the Hill, about why Indonesia should have a bilateral critical minerals agreement with the United States to be able to access some of the tax incentives. One of the challenges is, well, Indonesia needs to fix its ESG standards, etc., etc. Okay, hypothetically, if we fix all of our ESG standards, but our supply chain on EVs still come from China, would you take us? They can't really answer either. And so climate change now is not an environmental thing, it's not a public policy thing, it's actually a geopolitical thing. A former a minister of Indonesia actually once said to me, the days of economics in command, everybody follows, is over. Security is in command, everybody else follows. And I think that's a bit extreme, I think, but it does get a sense of the mood. So even climate change, I think, is a part of that. And this goes to the point about China. I think China has a limited set of interests. It's not as global domination as people like to think it is. But some of that key interest includes the US leaving Asia. I think we can I think it's fair to say it's not unthinkable that they would not be opposed to the idea of US leaving Asia, right? That's not extreme. But the question is, China's limited set of interests includes certain red lines, like Taiwan, like Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and some of these things. My sense is China right now, I don't know about next year, but right now, for example, China messes around the Singaporeans over their transportation of military hardware was because of Singapore's military exercises with Taiwan, right? That kind of behavior is no longer accepted now by the Chinese. And so for some of those red lines, I think China will push back. Is there a global red line for China? I'm not sure yet. I think China certainly doesn't rely on values, like, oh my God, if you become a democracy, we don't like you. Of course not. But I do think now with Ukraine and Gaza, the ability for China to make sure Putin doesn't collapse, to make sure that Iran doesn't collapse, I think is certainly there. So if China loses all of these particular tentative allies and partners, I think it's a challenge. But outside of those, I don't see China pushing Southeast Asia to not do stuff with the Europeans or the Americans, unless it has to do with Taiwan, unless it has to do with Xinjiang. But will that change? I don't know. I think if I were an American strategist in DC who is tasked with coming up with crazy, weird ideas to win competition, I would say one way to weaken China is support China's global role. Have them develop stuff all over the world and see if your overstretch doesn't kill you too the way it has killed the Americans. So in fact, the expansion of China's role is actually not great. They don't know how to deal with Africa. They don't know how to deal with some of the attacks they've seen in Pakistan, right? And so China is not ready to be a global power. China is a teenager at best in terms of the age of global power. So until the moment China is a mature global power with a specific set of things that they would not be crossed beyond their limited set of interests, kind of like America now, then I don't see China pushing back significantly on Southeast Asia across these things. But if we start doing what the Philippines is doing in terms of deploying assets from America that would reach Chinese mainland, yeah, they are going to push back. So far, I think the red lines are pretty clear. But as we move forward with U.S.-China competition global, is it going to be as clear? I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you so much. Now I think we've already concluded our session. Please give a round of applause again to Dr. Evan Laksmana. On behalf of our police community, the dean, I would like to extend my deepest gratitude to you having been here, and then we do hope this is not going to be your last time. It's going to be first, but hopefully next time around, so you be in Indonesia, we can always welcome you in this university. I think before we really conclude this, it will not be, conclude without any photos. So please, ladies and gentlemen, let's put our Brownbag and then come here all together and have a group session photo with Taiwan.
Sorry, before I go, I have to give this to you.
Okay. As a second comment after this. Second comment. Okay. Sarah, foto.
One, two, three. One more. One, two, three.
Dua lagi. Iya. Gimana?
Kayaknya mau belok.
Belok masuk.
Mana di center itu kan?
Oh,
Iya.
Terus ke bawah dulu kan ya?
Soalnya ini harus dulu hanya itu. Makanya aku pikir kalau
Satu lagi, sudah sisanya Pak Mau dari negara.
Ini nggak berhasil lagi. Ya, panjang banget soalnya. Nada-nadanya mau ditarik.
Ada yang mau saya?
Bisa bantu aku coba.
Kasihan Evan tadi apa minta minum waduh. Terus Evan.
Udah di M? Udah di M?
Rolali tidak perform baik di sini.
Iya. Ini jadi cetak rolali. Pas sulit terus ada yang tidak bekerja dengan baik siapa? Rolali masih bisa membantu.
Kalau dosen masih